Hello everyone and welcome back to more of the Fruit of Grisaia. In the last episode, the poor little doggy died and we had to eat it because, well, we were starving. And that was about it. Kind of trying to survive. Ibuki's kind of gone off the deep end, so we don't know what's going on with her. Obviously malnutrition is taking its toll on all of us. Some people are progressing faster than others, unfortunately. But just how long will this situation last? Mentally, physically, in every possible way, we were being taxed beyond our capacity to endure. How long can we possibly hold it together under such circumstances? Even Kazuki, our acknowledged authority on mental toughness, could no longer fully hide her fatigue. Her youthfully framed face, burdened with that accumulated exhaustion, seemed to have aged somehow. Gently closing her eyes, Kazuki breathed a brief sigh, then proceeded to depress me still further.
実はここだけの話、桜井先輩と広岡さんも相当にまずいのよね。
Sakura had initially been recovering fairly well, but our unsanitary environment and inability to adequately disinfect her wound proved catastrophic. She was beginning to exhibit symptoms of sepsis, almost certainly caused by bacteria invading through her wound. She was now running a high fever with a consistently elevated heartbeat. She tripped over her tongue when she tried to speak, and her limbs were routinely racked by brief, painful muscle spasms. As if her body was trying to contract, she needed antibiotics and soon. Ruka-san was no better. In fact, she was worse. Her debilitation had progressed to the point that she no longer showed any response to our voices. It all came down to inadequate treatment, compounded by worsening malnutrition. The dog had been our only halfway decent meal in days, otherwise we were getting by on cooked snails, wild grasses, and our gruel. Really nothing more than faintly colored water with a few grains of boiled rice floating at the bottom. Even minor energies couldn't heal on such a diet. On our first day stranded in this ravine, we ate fluffy white rice, steaming from the cooker. I couldn't get that memory out of my mind. Back then, we gobbled the rice down without a second thought, even had the nerve to complain about our coarse side dishes. Just remembering it made me want to scream at the pampered luxury of it all. We were so starved for sugar that tea made from the skins of onions almost tasted sweet to our tongues. But then again, our initial yearning for sweets only lasted for the first carefree week or so. At some point, we'd begun to crave salt far more than sugar. By now, we'd been reduced to licking the rust that formed on the wrecked frame of the bus after the days of rain. Wow. I had reached my absolute limit. When I crawled into bed at night, I hesitated to close my eyes, afraid I'd never open them again. But then again, maybe it would be better that way. If I let my eyelids fall shut, I would sink in deeply into blissful oblivion. If my heart would then quietly stop beating, wouldn't it be a blessing? I couldn't help but feel that a death without suffering would be a happier fate than to struggle on like this. But whenever I expressed those weak thoughts out loud, Kazuki would scold me.
まだ諦めるのは早いわ。
Kazuki whispered those words forcefully, as if trying to convince herself that they were true. It seemed too cruel to fire back. Then how long do we have to endure? How long before we could finally give up? I could find no further words, and silence settled on the tent. What is it, 14th day now? Yep, 14 days. When morning came, Kazuki struck the bottom of the pan at our normal wake-up time, but there were no signs of activity from within the tents. It wasn't that the others weren't awake, they just simply couldn't get up. Recently, just standing upright was exhausting. It wasn't rare for someone to spend the majority of the day lying in their sleeping bag. Even when we attempted to move, it would often prove impossible. Every time we tried to stand, our joints would scream in pain. If we pulled ourselves upright by clinging onto a tree or rock, our knees would be shaking so hard that we could barely walk. Even so, as the sun rose and warmed the valley, those who could still move came crawling slowly out of the tents. Basking in the rays of morning light, we resembled nothing so much as a lethargic pack of iguanas escaped from the Galapagos Islands. For some reason, it felt as though the mere touch of the sun on our skin gave us some small boost of energy. Of course, it was almost an illusion. Mostly an illusion, really. Our stomachs were still empty. But either way, moving around aimlessly would be a waste of calories. So we all found our seats in the sun and kept still. It was tempting to just flop down on the spot and close your eyes, but the cold stone beneath us stole body heat quickly, so lying down would burn a surprising amount of energy. Staying awake and sitting quietly was the best way to conserve our strength. We sat on the hard ground as if rooted onto the spot, unable to do anything but silently agonize over our individual fates. I've got to do something. How can I survive this? The thought churned endlessly around our heads, but merely focusing on our nourishment-starved brains on a question took all our effort. Actually producing an answer was beyond our power. And yet even now, we were still human beings. We still hadn't broken the absolute minimum rules.
まだ地獄ではない。まだ生き残る価値のある世界だわ。
At my side, Kazuki murmured those words to herself slowly and deliberately, as if confirming that she was still firmly conscious, still able to speak.
でもどうかしらね。もう時間の問題かもしれない。
I followed her gaze around the area. Everyone was staring goggle-eyed into the distance, their pale, slack faces shining greasily in the morning sun. There was something dangerous in the air, given a small push in the wrong direction. It felt as though our humanity would instantly crumble underneath us.
ユージ。今なんて？弟の名前よ。風見ユージ？そう。それが私の弟の名前。会ってみたいな。生きて帰ることができたら紹介してあげるわ。きっと気に入るはずよ。楽しみだな。きっとだよ。ええ、約束するわ。
That afternoon, Mr. Oshii returned from his escape attempt to rejoin us on our gradual, passive slide toward death. He was completely emaciated. His sunken eyes were as dark and hollow as those of a wild animal. But more than lamenting his failure, the group was overjoyed at his return. I see. He failed. We were back to the drawing board yet again. That was a heavy, if somewhat abstract disappointment. Even so, the return of our only adult male was no small relief. Not to say that our teacher's presence caused any dramatic changes in the situation. As always, we were desperately short of food. If anything, practically speaking, Mr. Ochi's return translated to nothing more than another mouth to feed, worsening our already meager daily rations. That evening, having entered the large tent to check up on the wounded, I noticed that Haruka-san had quietly stopped breathing. 2 weeks after Shikane, Ozawa, and Okabe's deaths, we had our fourth casualty. Haruka had died lying in the sleeping bag in which she spent the last 14 days of her life, her eyes and mouth half open. It was a gruesome sight. But there wasn't any real agitation among us. We'd all been prepared for this, even expecting it. I was no exception. Rather than grieving the death of my friend, I gazed down at her corpse in a stupor. A single thought was swirling relentlessly through my dull mind. Are we going to eat this one as well? When a living thing dies, it becomes food. Kazuki has said that it was only natural. So then, her too? I wasn't the only one suspecting as much. Without doubt, the others were thinking the exact same thing. If Captain Sakashita and Mr. Oshii had suddenly said, "All right, let's eat her," we would probably have looked into each other's faces for reassurance, then offered tacit acceptance by silence. We would have eaten our friend's corpse. At some point, all eyes turned toward our teacher. But Mr. Oshii only said, "I'll dig the grave," quietly bringing his hands together in front of Haruka's corpse. We're not going to eat her? As the words floated irrepressibly to the surface of my mind, the trance finally broke and I shivered in shock and revulsion. What was I thinking? Of course we were burying her. A human being eating another human being is unforgivable, no matter what. We must have been going a little soft in the head. Right, our friend had died. We were all upset. We lost our heads from shock, that's all. Our shoulders sagged to learn our stomachs would go unfilled, but all the same, we heaved sighs of relief. Without a single word of objection, we silently watched Mr. Ochi walk down into the forest to bury Haruka's remains. I'm a vile, disgusting excuse for a human being. The shame welled up so suddenly and so heavily inside me that I couldn't contain my tears. Lowering myself shakily down into the hard ground, I broke into wretched, violent sobs. The 15th day in the valley. I was awake, but I couldn't even open my eyes. My head felt packed to the bursting with dull, heavy lead. Every inch of my body was painfully cold and exhausted, to the point that even breathing was difficult. There wasn't a drop of saliva in my mouth, and the back of my throat burned bitterly. I couldn't even speak. This morning, Kazuki seemed to be in similar shape. When I finally managed to force my eyelids up just a sliver, I could vaguely see her lying perfectly still on the other side of the tent, curled up like a cat. I'd always admired her strength, wondered how she trained that tiny body to be so unbelievably tenacious. But it seemed that even her amazing endurance was reaching its limits. No, she'd probably long since passed those limits, but if Kazuki were to collapse, we would have lost a large source of hope. Without her, some of us might have long since given up, stopped even trying to survive. Kazuki had probably been pushing herself unreasonably for our sake, forcing herself to appear energetic and powerful. She looks so very small right now.
Kazuki.
I hoarsely croaked out her name. There was no response.
ねえ、Kazuki、死んじゃったの？
My arm had grown painfully thin, but it still felt heavy as I reached out towards my friend's back. She was still warm, and I could feel her back rising and falling ever so slightly with her breathing. She was still alive.
Kazuki、死んじゃ嫌だよ、Kazuki。
My tears-filled voice finally elicited a response from Kazuki. Her tone, understandably, was exceptionally grouchy.
もし私が死んだら、あなたが私を食べてね。なんてこと言うんだよ。
Kazuki's words abruptly brought back the memories of Haruka's death, and my breath caught in my throat.
死んだら嫌だよ、Kazuki。死ぬなら一緒に死んでよ。私を置いて、先に死んだら嫌だよ。
Surviving alone in this hell would be meaningless. Kazuki responded to my heartfelt whimpering with a sniffling little laugh.
冗談よ。大丈夫。私はまだ死なないわ。
She wasn't gonna die just yet, but eventually that time would come. Everything living dies, another rule of nature, most fundamental of all. That inevitable end was no longer an abstract, distant concept for us. Our debilitation had reached the final stages. One by one, we were wasting away. Today, Sakura, Senpai, and Komori-san were the casualties. Sakura died from her sepsis. Komori killed herself. We found her hanging from a tree. Numb as we groaned to horror, the suicide sent a disturbed ripple through the camp. But after the initial shock passed, we felt a little more than resigned acceptance. Since eating her dog's flesh, Komori had clearly been mentally unstable and physically frail. Even before her sudden collapse yesterday, we'd all seen her acting strangely. She would totter off alone into the forest and wander around calling loudly for Elion. And back at camp, she'd pushed her useless battery-dead cell phone against her ear and hold extended conversations with her dead pet. Everyone had felt vaguely apprehensive about her bizarre behavior, but there was nothing we could do for her. When the labored breathing of a girl sitting nearby grew faint as a whisper, the thought, another one's dying, would pass through our minds, but we didn't feel sorrow or pity. They were luxuries we could no longer afford. When Mr. Ochi carried each new corpse into the forest to bury it, the only thought we could muster was one less mouth to feed. Cold-hearted, cruel thoughts. But we no longer had even the strength to hate ourselves for them. Kaneda-senpai had begun to pick the maggots from the wound on her head and eat them. by consuming the fat larvae that had gorged themselves on the flesh around her festering wound. She'd regained the meat they stole from her, or such was her theory. She'd come completely unhinged. Even as I hazily speculated, Kennedy might well be the next to die. I felt slightly envious of her. Such a total disconnect from reality must have been more pleasant than looking soberly into the face of death. The terror of watching your friends die one after another. The terror that you might be next. The escalating terror of our reality overwhelmed us, and some began to escape from it entirely. Drunk on the adrenaline our brains secreted to numb the agonizing fear, our thoughts lurched into bizarre, irrational directions. I don't want to die. If somebody dies in my place, maybe I'll survive. Without any logic or evidence, many had begun to believe something of the sort. That inside this ravine, one life could somehow be traded for another. If somebody else dies, I'll live. In this claustrophobic little world where nothing enters or leaves, the total amount of well-being must be fixed. Depriving another of their happiness is the only path to survival. Such was the new dogma of the dying.
あんた早く死になよ。君こそ遠慮しないでさっさと死になよ。
That day, the only ones with enough energy to do more than sit limply on the ground cursing were Mr. Ochi and the captain. Since Mr. Ochi's return from the previous afternoon, the two of them had made numerous trips to forage for food on behalf of those who could no longer move. They even cooked meager meals of weeds and snails and fed them to the weakened girls. They spoke of encouragement as they spoon-fed the feeble. Don't give up, you can't die. If those two hadn't been there, none of us would have made it past morning. The thought drove home just how useless I was in comparison, and tears welled up in my eyes once again. Several times since Mr. Oji's return, the two had even managed to capture a few animals deep in the forest. Little chunks of venison and wild hare began to appear in the stranded weed soup. The girls who ate it slowly began to regain some of their vitality.
Kazuki, お肉だよ。ほら、久しぶり。私はいいわ。誰か他の子にあげて。どうして？うかつに肉を食べると肝炎になるわよ。ちゃんと火を通してるから大丈夫だよ。私はまだ死にたくないし、生き残った後苦しむのもごめんだわ。
By now, Captain Sakashita and Mr. Oshi were gathering the majority of the group's food. And Kazuki, whose sudden debilitation was so intense she had difficulty standing, had quickly and utterly lost the status she had gained among us since the fall. Everyone worshipped the captain like a god for providing food, and despite all the Kazuki had done for us up until now, no one expressed worry about her condition. Far from it. The looks they gave her clearly read, "Hurry up and die." Maybe she was resistant to the idea of accepting the Ascendant's captain's charity. Whatever the case, Kazuki absolutely refused to eat the meat her rival brought back from the forest. Idiotic pride for someone at death's door. But as irritated as I was, I couldn't betray or disobey Kazuki. I bitterly gave up our share of the meat, offering it to those who were even worse off. That night I would come to understand that I had made the correct choice in doing so. A little before dawn, I woke up to the rustling sound of someone moving around in the tent, sluggishly forcing open my heavy eyelids. I strained to see what was going on.
Amane, 起きなさい。Kazuki.
Kazuki had rolled up her sleeping bag and packed all her belongings in the rucksack she normally used as a pillow. One hand clutching my shoulder, she slowly shook me awake.
何？どうしたの？
Still half asleep, I spoke more loudly than I had intended. Kazuki quickly drew a forefinger to her mouth and whispered brief, "Shh."
あれを見なさい。
Kazuki lifted the flap of the tent, slightly open, and I peered through to see the captain and Mr. Oshi walking off together into the dark forest.
何？部長と先生、どこへ行くの？知る必要はないわ。チャンスは今よ。ここを抜け出しましょう。抜け出すってどういう？そのままの意味よ。この山を出て家に帰るの。もう助けなんか来ない。 自力で脱出するのよ。
I didn't understand what she was talking about. The words were clear enough, but the meaning just didn't register.
どうして今このタイミングで？説明している時間がないのよ。できるだけ急いで支度を済ませて誰にも気づかれないように。他のみんなは？
Kazuki fixed a deadly serious gaze directly on my eyes, and I faltered to a halt.
いい？あまね。鬼は連れていけない。わかる？わからないよ、カズキ。鬼ってどういう意味？知りたいのなら後で教えてあげる。いいから今は急ぎなさい。
To be honest, I didn't have the first idea about what was going on, but Kazuki was never wrong. If Kazuki told me to leave, I would leave. That simple faith was guiding me now. I stuffed my possessions into the rucksack as quickly as I could in the dim tent. Barely waiting for me to finish, Kazuki impatiently grabbed my hand and pulled me along, quickly and quietly leading me out of the camp.
カズキ、どこへ行くの？静かについていらっしゃい。今全部見せてあげる。見せる？いい。決して大きな声を出してはダメよ。わかっ。
Just what was she planning to show me? Clueless but obedient, I passively followed Kazuki down the valley and into the forest. We were retracing the steps of Mr. Ochi and Captain Sakashita. For some reason, that realization filled me with dread. Some instinct was whispering faintly, "Don't go any further. Don't take another step." Some truths are best left unseen. My skin tingled as though all the pores in my body had suddenly opened wide. With every step, my heartbeat grew louder in my ears. Cold, sticky sweat settled oppositely in my armpits. Just a quick warning, everybody. The following scenes that are coming up are quite graphic and gruesome, so if you have weak constitutions, I recommend you not continuing. But if you do want to see it, then, well, I can't stop you. So, just so you know, be prepared. Whispering so softly I could barely hear her over the cries of the cicadas, Kazuki pointed through a thicket to the clearing beyond. Captain Sakashita and Mr. Oshi were inside, completely naked, making violent love like a pair of beasts. Wow. Illuminated by the faint moonlight that slipped through the cracks in the tree canopy, the captain's white skin shone vividly in the darkness. In their frenzy, they had yielded utterly to the base instinct for survival, the impulse to preserve their genes. Reveling in her obedience to that animal instinct, the captain screamed with crazed pleasure. Digging his fingernails into Sakashita's pale skin, Mr. Ochi slammed his waist against her, slobbering, dribbling from his mouth with every thrust. I apologize, I'm going to have to censor the image, so you will see black bars over the text, but don't worry, I will tell you the text.
あなた、何を見ているの？周りをもっとよく見てごらんなさい。
Kazuki looked carefully at the surroundings. I removed my glasses, carefully wiping the lenses with the cuff of my uniform, then put them back on. As the scene came into clear focus, I finally noticed. Lying in the grass around them were the scattered fragments of a truth better left unseen. At first glance, the objects lying here and there amid the pair's clothes looked almost like oversized radishes. In the faint light, it took a moment for me to realize that the long, white, slender vegetables were the dissected limbs of human beings. I couldn't contain my shriek, and before I had time to regret that mistake, tears were pouring out of my eyes. Bile was rising in my throat, and I was stumbling backward, falling to the ground. It was a scene most ghastly indeed. My shoulders quivered at the vicious shout, but I simply could not stand. My legs had turned to rubber. My eyes were fixed, unblinking, on the scene before me. The face of Mr. Oshi glaring in our direction with eyes like a demon's, and the mutilated body that lay in chunks around the clearing. The silver bracelet was wrapped around one of the dismembered arms. Even in the dim moonlight, the word Allion was clearly visible on its plate. That was Akun's collar. When the dog wasted away and died, Komori had coiled it around her wrist, which had to mean that arm was hers. Oh god, oh god, oh god. The meat everyone had eaten, oh my god. Oh man. Burning tide of gastric juices surged up in my throat as I noisily vomited onto the ground. Kazuki grabbed me by the shoulder. With the thought we're going to run now, she forcibly dragged me to my feet. Disoriented, the taste of acid thick in my mouth, I let Kazuki pull me into a run. From behind, I heard the captain's snarling voice. The voice that had always encouraged me during practice, firm but kind. Good hustle out there. The voice that had offered all of us reassurance as she distributed the food. Don't give up. Captain Shakashita's voice was now the voice of a ghoul.